My name's Louise Buckingham and I work for Horticulture Innovation Australia. So I think we all got the message loud and clear that ending contracts is not necessarily or probably even likely to be the right course of action. But what is? What are the corrective steps, or how do you manage the relationship in a way that is actually ethical and productive and compliant?
So within your, this is where the intention of the legislation is for organisations to use their commercial leverage to address modern slavery. And so depending on how much commercial leverage you have over your supplier, there's certain corrective actions that you may wish to negotiate with that particular supplier to address those risks. And they may be, depending on what those specific risks are, they might be better labour rights practices, they may be obviously freedom of movement practices, what rights are provided to workers. So in terms of how you are essentially using your commercial leverage to implement whatever corrective action procedures you see to address those risks. And I kind of use the example of the 10 t-shirt factories in Bangladesh, 3 of them which have very poor labour rights, very good labour rights practices, 5 which have terrible labour rights practices, and 2 that are simply in the middle. If you are investing $1 million into one of those factories in circumstances where you're remediating with your supplier that has poor practices, or taking your $1 million to the one with good practices, it's likely that that particular supplier is going to want to implement your corrective action policy to retain your business. And what happens then is those 3 t-shirt factories become 4 t-shirt factories, and the other ones that remain having poor practices, there's a lot of incentive to correct their own procedures, which is the intention of the legislation to move the needle on modern slavery.
I'm just going to add to that 3 really quick things. The first is you only have leverage while you have a contract. So once the contract's over, you've lost most of your leverage. The second is to adopt, I guess, to paraphrase, a performance management approach, to set very clear signals about what change you need to see within what time period, what's acceptable and what isn't. And again, just to sort of to synthesize that, whether you're talking about sustainable procurement or modern slavery, your goal is to have a competitive market, not to have a limited market. So as much as you can within reason to work with suppliers to improve things means at the end of the day you have a much more competitive market.
So the only thing that we've drafted up at the moment that we've drafted up a little bit is with all that in mind is also I use the word a flowchart, but a decision sort of matrix which looks at the severity of it and makes you sort of react differently depending on what you actually see and whether or not a victim's in serious harm directly or sort of indirectly, and that sort of approach is how we're trying to sort of look at that sort of decision matrix.
Can I just add one thing? So the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights basically require or expect from you to engage with your suppliers. So influence, just like they've mentioned already. So you may be making the situation much worse for the workers in your supply chain if you step away and you terminate the contract. I think there's just something to keep in mind. So you keep working with the supplier for as long as you can and try to influence as much as you can. Yeah, that's sort of the message of the UN Guiding Principles as well.
Okay. Thank you, Shapila. I'm gonna go to you, sir.
Yeah, Tim Veenstra, work for Stockland. So with the audit process, short of walking into a factory in Afghanistan or the head office of a cleaning company and checking their filing cabinets, how do you know when you're asking the questions and you're auditing that you're actually getting true and honest answers? Like where does the value and the authenticity of the audit process?
Audits have their place, definitely. I think you need to do them to sort of tick that box. But yeah, I'm not really sure how effective they are at really spotting it in some ways. I think that some of the stuff that Robin talked around having a poster in your warehouses or in our retail centres, so that our cleaning contractor can see it, and get sort of advice from that, I think may be actually more an effective way of doing things than actual audits. But that's just, I think that's the sort of what we're trying to learn as we go through this. Again, that's why, going back to my presentation a little bit, that's why we try and frame it in what the problem is, rather than sort of exactly how we're going to solve it through processes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because unless the questions are getting to the workers, those types of audits are no more than self-assessment. So there's various auditing methodologies that are effective in terms of getting to those workers and really genuinely identifying modern slavery risks.
So yeah, just one more thing on that. I mean, well, especially when we're looking overseas, we definitely have a third-party auditor which is on the ground, that knows the local environments, naturally knows some of the actual employees, and can have those sorts of conversations outside of those sorts of areas. So I think a local NGOs or a real trusted auditor is kind of key, and that they do have procedures where they do talk to workers when you're looking for sort of overseas sort of audits.
So as organisations, it's going to take some time to get the audit process really effective, to know that you're getting genuine answers. Otherwise, how do you discover the modern slavery? Yeah.
That's right. And I think one of the other, sorry, I'm monopolised here. One of the other things as well that kind of, as I've gone through this, I've kind of picked up on, and that is, you can look at sort of indicators, as we sort of said, sort of if you know that they're not being paid correctly, if you walk into somewhere and they don't know any fire procedures, kind of, I think there's those sorts of indicators that lead you to perhaps want to dig that a little bit deeper, if you spot those.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to go to the gentleman here with the glasses.
Just wanted to mention something about audits, because I think people do keep asking these questions. Rana Plaza, has everyone heard of Rana Plaza tragedy? They had their audits done weeks prior to the tragedy, before the building collapsed. So they're just one of the, I guess, signs of that audits are not answer to everything, they're part of it. And I think what is really important is to educate your suppliers, to engage with them, build trust, and make sure they're on the same page, to actually understand human rights and sustainability in general. Yeah, I'll stop here. I know it's no time. But.
No, it's okay. It's a good conversation, so thank you for that, Shabila.
Hi, David Baggs from Global Green Tag. We are actually product certifiers, and we audit and assess products literally at a molecular level and at an ethical supply chain level. It seems to me that there's a couple of rather large elephants in the room that people are kind of, stepping around, and one of them is that it's really easy to look at single supply chains and go, okay, we can do an audit, we can step in and we can go and have a look, particularly when there's a direct contractual relationship. But it's really easy to structure a supply chain so that very quickly becomes impervious, and where the person that you're contracting has no direct contractual relationship with the problematic supply chains. So there's a very quick impermeability that comes into supply chains that becomes quite problematical at times. The other thing is that everybody here who's spoken so far has mentioned that they're going to go out and do audits. Is no one else hearing the duplication and the amount of imposition that's placing on a manufacturer who might have 1,000 products in his supply chain map, each with their own individual supply chains? So, we're struggling with this, and, because we do this on a daily basis, and we have been for the last 10 years. The legislation as it's enacted brings certain other aspects into play. You literally can't do a walk-in inspection on a factory you have that your contractual relationship has no contractual relationship with. So there's a whole lot of really, sort of deep questions that relate to all of this stuff. And the only solution that we've been able to sort of come up with, and I'd be interested in having feedback on this, is a product level supply chain transparency and risk analysis assessment that is generated by a manufacturer that would be in compliance with the legislation, so that because I just can't imagine being in Stockland's position or any of the major contractors' positions having to do a supply chain report and saying to a manufacturer where you're buying maybe 5 products out of a suite of 1,000, tell me your supply chain risk on the products I'm buying, and they hand you over a corporate report, say there it is, deal with it.
Yeah.
So, has anybody given thought to
I'm
where we
gonna
go
throw to
beyond the
Kim.
policy?
I reckon
Yeah,
Kim's
so-
nodding at me going, yes, I
Can
can
I
talk
just
to
have
this
the
one.
clicker for a moment?
Of course
and
you
I'll-
can.
So I think in terms of what I'm hearing is how an organisation maps their supply chain and assesses risk is very important. And so if you can do that, there's several ways in which you can map a supply chain, and I think what I'm hearing is that process is extremely complex because each product and each material that goes into what you're assessing has its own supply chain. So that's right. So if you are looking at the supply chain of a mobile phone and you're looking at, say, glass and plastic, what I'm hearing is that each of those products that are going into that mobile phone have their own supply chain, which makes supply chain mapping very, very complex. But there's big data sets and there's free trade flow information and there's lots of different ways that can be automated through technology to essentially do that for an organisation's supply chain. Those in procurement may be familiar with some of those technologies. That's certainly the methodology that we use when we're mapping supply chains, so that it's actually going deep within the supply chain and seeing where modern slavery risk is aggregating. So this is, I guess, an example of results from a supply chain map that we've done, and we can see here that the actual modern slavery risk is aggregating at about tier 3 of a supply chain, and we can tell you why and what country that's in based on the methodology that we're using. But I guess I would agree with you in that mapping process is very, very complex, and that there is certainly help and methodologies and technology available for organisations to assist you with that process.
You may have misheard me. So I actually said that we're relying on certification, and Green Tag is one of those. And in fact, I've just been around this week, it's day 4, and I've been to Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, and today Sydney, talking to my project management teams and running them through the supply chain sustainability, their video on where it might be hiding in our supply chain, and it points to certifying bodies like yours. When we have a product that we want to use, we think it's the right product, we think it is the right thing for the development, and we haven't got certification, then we may choose to actually go and do audits and work through one-on-one. And in fact, we did that on Green Hills. We had EY go through, get certification for key products with our subcontractors, but the stone didn't, and so we sent them in there to work with the stone supplier. I agree, we need industry collaboration, because otherwise we're going to make this a really expensive undertaking, and when it becomes expensive, we start getting disengagement from various different aspects of the organisation. So big on industry collaboration, big on using what's already there, but also still very big on the learning curve. We're really just, finding our way through on it.
I just got comment, because you're absolutely correct in saying that if you actually have long-term, sort of contracts and relationships with your supply chain, you probably won't be in that supply chain. It is where that supply chain link has been broken somehow, and that responsibility doesn't get passed across. So it is those one-offs and those kind of ad hoc buying sort of things where you suddenly need something for a specific project. So Again, it's yeah. So sometimes it is much more around giving that awareness, so people know to see that, because that is we got it now is that's probably sort of where our highest risk is. It's not where we know the factory and we've been there a million times and we know what's going on. So it's a really good point that where you see fractured supply chains, or you know that someone's not asking further down the line, go and investigate or don't use them. Absolutely agree. And then the only other thing to mention is just on sort of collaboration, things like that. The Property Council of Australia, we are all banding together as a group to try and make sure that suppliers and subcontractors only answer a single set of questions. They go into a central database, and we can all go and look there for their responses to try and alleviate their, the amount of effort that they take to because we're all asking the same questions, as you said.
Perfect. Thank you, panellists. There's just time for one more question. Yes, please.
Emma from UGL. So we are a construction, manufacturing and an asset management firm. I work in the commercial department. So my question is, buying sustainably comes at a cost, and then you would pass on that cost to the end customer. How would you go about educating your customer base about paying a bit more for the added benefits, the longer term benefits? Because how would you rationalise that and educate the customer about paying more for more?
So my aim is for the customer not to pay more for more. I think, I showed you the Stockland and Mirvac would be very similar.
Yeah.
If our customers found that we knowingly had modern slavery in our supply chains and we found that okay, it would cost us a lot of money. Reputation, brand, the rest, and that's really, apart from it's the right thing to do, commercially it's an absolute must. And I don't see that we do need to pay more because we're already paying for quality. So if we were a different brand and we were doing a lot of very cheap kind of product, then maybe we would have that issue and we'd have to have that discussion. But I think we're both in a similar space where we've already got a certain level of quality, and now it's just about making sure that we've got the right suppliers and working with them to have the right outcome.
Yeah, I think everyone in general is looking at total cost of ownership and things like that a lot more. But so quality products are they always pay off in the long run, and we've got a lot of data to show how that sort of works with the life cycle analysis that we do on a lot of stuff now.
Have you encountered challenges where the customer struggles to see the cost of ownership and focusing more on the short term?
I think there's always more we can do to kind of educate people around this sort of stuff, because it's interesting that if you look at what we put into our office buildings and the amount of rigour around the Green Star and the low VOC and all the wonderful stuff we put in there, we don't get asked the same sort of questions by a residential owner, and they don't go around with a tick box going from one development to the next saying, is this a recycled carpet, or is this low VOC paint? They don't go around with that checklist. So I think there's always, and that's obviously quite specific to Mirvac in the residential sort of housing market, but unless people are going to go around with that checklist, then Somaiya's going to continue to do it. But I think it'd be good for them if they did.